vision, or have another print disability which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Corrine, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the March 24th, 2026 issue of the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Thank you for joining us today. The highlights under business and finance are: major U.S. stock indexes surged on news of a postponement of U.S. strikes on Iranian power plants, with the S&P 500 rising 1.1% and the Dow and Nasdaq both advancing 1.4%. Bonds rallied. Rising prices of services from haircuts to healthcare are taking center stage in the Fed's fight against inflation. OpenAI hired Dave Dugan, a former top advertising executive at Meta Platforms, to lead its ad sales. Mark Zuckerberg is building a personal artificial intelligence agent to help him do his job as Meta Platforms' chief executive. Dannon agreed to buy nutrition startup Huel for about $1.2 billion, seeking to tap growing demand for meal replacement shakes. Victory Capital dismissed reports that major clients are uneasy with its bid for Janus Henderson, calling the claims misleading. Hyundai is working to fix tens of thousands of three-row SUVs after receiving reports of occupants becoming trapped by powered rear seats. Berkshire Hathaway plans to acquire a 2.5% stake in Japanese insurer Tokio Marine for $1.8 billion as part of a strategic partnership. NVIDIA and Emerald AI said they would work with power producers to develop a new class of artificial intelligence factory. Intuit accelerated its stock buyback program and ended scheduled stock sales by senior managers to help shore up its share price. Now for the highlights under the worldwide section. Trump said the U.S. military would postpone strikes on Iranian power plants and energy infrastructure for 5 days, following productive talks between Washington and Tehran, contradicting Iran's foreign ministry, which said there were no direct talks. Senators were closing in on a deal to fund the Department of Homeland Security except for ICE, signaling a possible breakthrough after a standoff that has lasted more than a month. The Supreme Court appeared inclined to block states from counting mailed ballots that are postmarked by Election Day, but arrive a few days afterward. Trump rejected a possible avenue for resolving the impasse over DHS funding. ICE agents were deployed to several U.S. airports to help manage long security lines amid the lapse in the funding for the Department of Homeland Security. Senator Mark Wayne Mullen won confirmation to replace Kristi Noem as Homeland Security Secretary. A landmark free trade deal between the EU and 4 South American countries will come into force May 1st after more than 25 years of negotiations. Hundreds of designers, clerks, and technicians went on strike in Maine at one of the Navy's largest shipbuilding contractors. The Pentagon introduced new restrictions on press access after a federal judge struck down earlier limits as unconstitutional. An experimental Lyme disease vaccine from Pfizer and Valneva didn't conclusively succeed in a large study. A military transport aircraft carrying Colombian troops crashed in the south of the country, killing dozens. Died David Simon, 64, deal-making mall investor. Leo Radvinsky, 43, OnlyFans owner. The picture on today's front page shows an Air Canada Express plane with its nose up in the air and the rear of the plane on the tarmac as rescue crews are attending the victims. Tarmac tragedy. An Air Canada Express jetliner struck a fire truck on a runway at New York City's LaGuardia Airport late Sunday, killing 2 pilots and injuring 41 people. The airport, which has had a shortage of air control staff, reopened Monday. And that caption reads, "Pilots killed as plane rams fire truck at LaGuardia." The article, LaGuardia collision kills 2 pilots. Landing plane hit emergency vehicle that entered runway in a deadly accident, by Garrett Vipers, Benjamin Katz, and Dean Seal. New York City's LaGuardia Airport reopened Monday afternoon after a runaway collision between a passenger jet and an emergency vehicle killed 2 pilots and injured dozens of other people. The jet, an Air Canada Express plane arriving from Montreal, struck a firefighting vehicle shortly before midnight Sunday, according to the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. In addition to the 2 pilots killed in the crash, 41 people, including passengers, crew, and 2 aircraft rescue and firefighting officers, were taken to the hospital, a Port Authority spokesman said. These were 2 young men at the start of their careers, Brian Bedford, administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration, said of the pilots at a Monday news conference. Jazz Aviation Flight AC 8646, operated on behalf of Air Canada, smashed into the Port Authority fire truck as soon as it entered the runway, according to a person familiar with the airport's operations. The person said the truck toppled over as sparks, smoke, and debris erupted from the plane. The truck's crew was responding to a separate incident. One of the pilots who was killed and 1 flight attendant who was injured were found by rescuers outside of the aircraft on the ground, the person said. Jazz Aviation said the preliminary passenger list indicated that the aircraft was carrying 72 passengers and 4 crew members. The FAA implemented a full ground stop at the airport until Monday afternoon. At 2 p.m. Eastern, LaGuardia said on its official social media account that it had reopened, but travelers should expect residual delays and cancellations. Only one runway was in use as of Monday night, the Port Authority said. At about 11:37 p.m. Sunday, an air traffic controller cleared the rescue truck to cross runway 4. Moments earlier, pilots on a departing United flight had declared an emergency after crew reported feeling ill from an odor in the cabin, according to tower radio messages. The audio from air traffic control detailed the moments leading up to the collision. Truck 1 and company crossing 4 at Delta. The fire truck confirmed to the air traffic control tower. About 7 seconds later, the air traffic controller comes back on the radio. Stop, 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 stop. Truck 1, stop, 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 stop. Truck 1, stop. Before electronic chime bells can be heard. Footage from the scene showed the front end of the Air Canada Express jet sheared off roughly where the plane's front doors are located. The National Transportation Safety Board said its team started arriving at LaGuardia early Monday morning and was still sifting through debris as of Monday evening. A cockpit voice recorder has been recovered undamaged, and work on the plane's flight data recorder, the other half of the black box, will begin on Tuesday. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy said the airport was well staffed, but still has a shortage of fully trained air traffic controllers. Articles from the front page. Stocks were headed for a rout, then Trump hit social media. Investors welcomed efforts to end a war that has driven up energy prices. By Sam Goldfarb. The sun was rising early Monday on another bleak day for markets. Oil prices were climbing. Stock futures were sliding. A rout in government bonds was showing no signs of abating. Then President Trump took to social media. A little after 7 a.m. Eastern Time, he posted that the U.S. military would postpone strikes on Iranian power plants. The reason? Productive conversations regarding a complete and total resolution of our hostilities. The reversal was immediate and stark. Stock futures surged into the green, swinging a decline of almost 1% into a climb briefly exceeding 2.5%. Oil futures dropped precipitously, with Brent, the global gauge, falling from above $112 a barrel to below $100 in seconds. Bonds rallied. Even after Iran denied talks, the tone was set. Investors cheered the efforts to end a war that has sparked the largest oil shock on record, while threatening to fuel inflation and slow global growth. The Dow Jones Industrial Average and the S&P 500 posted their biggest one-day gains since early February, with the Dow Industrials rising 1.4% and the S&P advancing 1.1%. The Nasdaq Composite added 1.4%. Brent ended the session down 11%, just below $100 a barrel, its lowest level since March 11th. A little bit of light or a little bit of good news can go a long way, said Keith Lerner, Chief Investment Officer at Truist Advisory Services. Before this weekend, a lot of people were thinking about worst-case scenarios. Instead, Monday morning found them racing to shift their expectations. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. War in Iran endangers political prisoners. U.S.-Israeli airstrikes have damaged complexes used to hold detainees. By Joe Parkinson, Drew Henshaw, and Belle Cushing. Lindsay Foreman was hunched over the landline in Ward 7 of Tehran's Evin prison, telling her son Joe that the U.S.-Israeli bombing campaign had started. Warplanes had been circling above the Iranian capital all morning, and the rumble of explosions had sent prisoners scurrying beneath their bunks. "It's begun," said the British mother of two, arrested a year ago on a motorcycle trip with her husband for espionage charges she denies. Then a bomb blast ripped through the windows of her prison, home to dissidents, a Nobel Prize winner, and at least 3 Americans Iran holds hostage as bargaining chips. "Shh, shh, what was that?" Lindsay asked, screams echoing in the gray-tiled hallway. The line cut. In another corner of the prison, Almadriza D. Jalali, an Iranian-Swedish doctor, was calling his wife. The Harvard fellow was a scholar on treating disease-zone victims, but had been sentenced to death by a revolutionary court in Tehran for espionage charges he denied. Airstrikes had blown out windows in Ward 4, and plaster was falling from the ceiling, he told her. Dozens of regular prison officers had fled and been replaced by hard-line Revolutionary Guards. The single food store, where prisoners could supplement meager rations of chicken grizzle and rice, had closed, and some of the most outspoken opponents of Iran's theocratic regime were growing hungry in their cells. "This situation feels like chaos," Djali said to her. Iran's repressive regime has some 200,000 prisoners, including political dissidents, would-be reformists, recent protesters, civilians who ran afoul of religious codes, and a handful of American and European hostages. They are held in a network of prisons, including the notorious Evin, as well as secretive detention centers within security and intelligence complexes. Many are the leaders of a nebulous protest movement that President Trump has urged to rise up and topple a regime in power for almost half a century. So far, the war in Iran has put them in even graver danger. The senators talk deal to fund DHS, TSA, by Lindsay Wise, Siobhan Hughes, and Natalie Andrews, Washington. Senators said they were closing in on a deal to fund the Department of Homeland Security, except for the agency that carries out immigrant arrest and deportations, signaling a possible breakthrough after a more than a month-long standoff. Both sides are talking in a serious way, said Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, as he left the Capitol Monday night. The potential breakthrough came after a meeting at the White House between President Trump and a group of GOP senators, including Senator Katie Britt, Republican from Alaska. "It went really well," Britt said afterward. Asked if they had a solution, she said, "We do." She declined to share details. Pressure has been growing on lawmakers to resolve the impasse, which was sparked last month by Democrats' demands for more restrictions on immigration enforcement agents. Republicans have a 53 to 47 majority in the Senate, but 60 votes are needed to advance most legislation. A lapse in funding at the Transportation Security Administration, part of DHS, has led to long security lines at airports across the country as unpaid employees skip work. The approach under discussion would restore funding for all of DHS, except for the arm of Immigration and Customs Enforcement that carries out immigrant arrest and deportations, called Enforcement and Removal Operations, Democratic senators said. Under the potential deal, funding would be restored to ICE's other primary function, called Homeland Security Investigations, which looks into complex international crimes such as drug smuggling or human trafficking, said Senator Chris Coons, Democrat from Delaware. Ads on fridge? Some owners say that's not cool. Samsung ushers in controversial new era of marketing in the kitchen by Ji Jong-sung. Walking into his kitchen, Tim Yoder recoiled at the message on his refrigerator door. Shop Samsung water filters. Yoder, a supply chain manager in Chicago, owns a Samsung Electronics Family Hub fridge. He paid $1,400 for an appliance that came with a 32-inch screen on the door that allows him to control other Samsung gadgets, pull up recipes, or stream music. But since last fall, it's been intermittently serving up ads, part of a pilot program being tested on some of Samsung's smart fridges sold in the U.S. The response, not warm. I guess this is another place for somebody to shove an ad in your face, said the 47-year-old Yoder, recalling the first time he noticed one. The ads are only on certain family hub fridges that have screens and internet connectivity. Leaving the front page, World Watch. Colombia. Military plane crash kills dozens. A large military transport plane carrying Colombian Army troops crashed Monday in a forested part of the country's southern jungles, killing dozens as its fuselage was engulfed in flames after hitting the ground, officials said. The aircraft, a Lockheed Martin Hercules C-130, was lifting off from Puerto Leguizamo, a town on the Putumayo River across from Peru. When it went down, Defense Minister Pedro Sanchez said. The turboprop plane was carrying 114 passengers and 11 crew members, said General Carlos Silva, commander of Colombia's Air Force. 38 aboard the plane had died. 83 were injured and 4 couldn't be found, said Puerto Leguizamo's top security and administrative aide, Carlos Claris. United Kingdom. Jewish charities ambulances burned. 4 ambulances belonging to a Jewish charity were set on fire early Monday in London in what police are investigating as an anti-Semitic hate crime. No one was injured in the attack. Religious and political leaders condemned what Prime Minister Keir Starmer called a horrific anti-Semitic attack. Officers were called to Golders Green, a North London neighborhood with a large Jewish population, after receiving reports of a fire, the Metropolitan Police Force said. 4 ambulances belonging to the Hatzola Northwest, a volunteer organization that provides emergency medical response, were damaged, according to the London Fire Brigade. Europe quietly plays crucial war role, by Max Colchester and Bojan Pancheski. President Trump has criticized Europe for staying on the sidelines in the Iran war, but many European countries are quietly playing a crucial supporting role. While many European leaders have publicly decried the U.S. attacks on Iran, behind the scenes, their military bases are facilitating one of the most logistically complex operations the U.S. military has been involved in for decades. In recent weeks, U.S. bombers, drones, and ships have been fueled, armed, and launched via bases in the UK, Germany, Portugal, Italy, France, and Greece, officials say. Attack drones are being directed from a U.S. base at Ramstein in Germany, the nerve center of U.S. operations against Iran, German and U.S. officials said. Heavy B-1 bombers have been photographed loading munitions and fuel at RAF Fairford in the UK. The USS Gerald R. Ford, the world's largest aircraft carrier, is docked at a naval base in Crete to undergo repairs after suffering damage from a fire. U.S. Air Force General Alexis Grinkovich, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's top military commander, said in recent Senate testimony that most European allies have been extremely supportive. The continent, which is home to around 40 U.S. military bases and 80,000 U.S. service personnel, is a launchpad for U.S. operations in both the Middle East and Africa. The distances are shorter, it's less expensive, and it's much easier to project power with our network of bases and allies, he said. For years, Trump has berated his European counterparts and hinted that the U.S. might pull support for NATO, including, most recently, when Europeans initially refused to answer his calls to escort shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. Operation Epic Fury shows the price the U.S. would pay if it fully withdrew its military presence from the continent. While European militaries have shrunk since the end of the Cold War, they remain trusted allies. A network of bilateral agreements with European governments allows U.S. ammunition, technology, and personnel to be positioned at European bases. Europe's location at the intersection of Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia makes it ideal for rapid deployment in all directions. Retired Major General Gordon B. Davis, a former director of operations at U.S. European Command, told the Center for European Policy Analysis last year. Bases in Europe house critical U.S. intelligence and reconnaissance capabilities. Aircraft can refuel and rearm on the ground rather than flying many extra hours back to the U.S. The bases allow the U.S. to quickly detect threats headed toward the homeland, deter Russia, and project force abroad, some analysts say. This setup has been stress tested by the current conflict. European leaders are wary of being seen to directly support the war, which is driving up energy costs and proving deeply unpopular with voters. They also want to avoid alienating the U.S. So far, political dissent at the top hasn't translated into operational constraint on the ground. The exception is Spain, which has denied the U.S. permission to use jointly operated military bases on its territory to attack Iran. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer also barred the U.S. from using UK air bases during the initial assault on Tehran. He later changed his position, saying the U.S. could fly defensive bombing missions to target Iranian missile launchers from both RAF Fairford and the Diego Garcia base in the Indian Ocean. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. From the editorial page. Is $200 billion too much to win a war? Republicans backed Biden on Ukraine, but Democrats balk on Iran. The Trump administration may soon ask Congress for $200 billion for the U.S. military, and on cue come the snipers. The number is too big, or the Iran fight isn't worth it. But the war is exposing pre-existing U.S. military vulnerabilities, and the president's job is not merely restocking arsenals, but preparing U.S. forces to deter the next war. It's instructive to watch Democrats vote down a U.S. military funding bill before it even exists. The answer is a simple no. Senator Ruben Gallego of Arizona said on social media, warning of a long war after all of 3 weeks of fighting. Representative Ro Khanna of California offered the dorm room politics that $200 billion could pay for free college for every American, and so much more. Both men have ambitions to be commander-in-chief. Yikes. At this point, I would oppose that supplemental of $200 billion. Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal told CNN. Such support could be misinterpreted as approval of the war. Democrats don't want to be complicit in helping America be victorious, which would help their main enemy, who is Mr. Trump. But only a couple news cycles ago, Mr. Blumenthal told CNN that he worried the war would be a setback for Ukraine. We've been told again and again and again, one reason that we can't provide interceptors for the Patriot system or other munitions for Ukraine is that they're in short supply. Yet, replenishing weapons stocks and expanding production with urgency is sure to be a core priority of the funding request. The Trump Pentagon is working to expand lines of crucial missiles, including bumping advanced Patriot interceptor production to 2,000 rounds a year. But the Pentagon told lawmakers last year it was $20 to $30 billion short for munitions, and that was before the Iran war. American air dominance over Iran has allowed U.S. forces to rely on cheaper munitions, but no question the U.S. has expended far more Tomahawk missiles than the Pentagon requested this year, 57. Tom Carrico, The missile defense ace at the Center for Strategic and International Studies said recently he is dreading finding out how many air defense interceptors the U.S. has fired. Stocks have long been low for a crisis in the Taiwan Strait. A crash project to build thousands will now cost many billions more, and the priority of bulk buys should be speed, which means paying a time premium. The action in Iran has also underscored that drones are delivering a new economics of warfare, which demands cheap cruise missiles, high-power microwaves for drone defense, reusable interceptors on ships. Nobody wants to hear it, but success would mean underwriting many procurement experiments and some systems that don't pan out. The war is also demonstrating that naval and air power are still essential in modern combat. The USS Gerald R. Ford may break a post-Vietnam record for the longest aircraft carrier deployment, which means higher maintenance bills. The U.S. for years has been burning naval readiness faster than it produces it, and ditto for the fighter and bomber fleets. That it took weeks to flow enough American forces into the region to strike even a lesser power is a warning. The U.S. military isn't sized for a long fight with a real competitor. The Trump defense strategy acknowledges the simultaneity problem, the risk that an American enemy in one region exploits U.S. involvement in another. Will the supplemental start to reduce that risk by expanding ships, aircraft, and personnel, all expensive? Mr. Trump will have to make a sustained public case for the details of the request, from repairing damage to U.S. bases to refilling combat pay accounts. Too bad Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth couldn't resist blaming Joe Biden for expending weapons in Ukraine. These munitions are better spent in our own interest, he said. That is substantively wrong and politically inept. America's position in the world would be far weaker if Ukraine had collapsed. More than 20 GOP senators supported Mr. Biden's Ukraine request in 2024 because they understood it was in America's interest. Mr. Trump could include support for Ukraine, buying some of Kyiv's counter-drone hardware, for instance, and press Democrats to pass it. The U.S. isn't meeting the 5% of GDP standard for defense that Mr. Trump demanded for NATO. This is a national liability that predates the Iran war, and $200 billion is a realistic number for starting to fix the problem, so Americans never again read headlines about insufficient missile stocks days into a war. A welcome setback for medical DEI. A medical school accreditor removes race-based guidance. Some of the worst excesses of racial identity politics have been in U.S. medical schools, but maybe that is starting to change. The Liaison Committee on Medical Education, LCME, which accredits MD granting institutions, has quietly removed diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI protocols, from its official guidance. Under the old guidance on curricular standards, schools were advised to mind their cultural competence and healthcare disparities. The section introduced medical school faculty to make sure doctors in training learn to recognize and appropriately address biases in themselves, in others, and in the healthcare delivery process. Medical schools were told that their curriculum should include content about the diverse manner in which people perceive health and illness, and the basic principles of culturally competent healthcare. This sounds nice, but it is really a call to treat people of different races differently, and not only for appropriate medical reasons such as the prevalence of sickle cell disease. A doctor's professional responsibility should be to apply medical knowledge to treat all patients equally, regardless of race. Instead, medical students have been required to spend hours on anti-racist protocols that amount to indoctrination in identity politics rather than building medical expertise. The new standards instead encourage practice-based learning and improvement, emphasizing that medical school faculty should help students acquire skills of self-directed learning, including the ability to self-identify critical gaps in knowledge or understanding, and to find relevant information to fill those gaps. That's a real improvement. Last month, Dr. Stanley Goldfarb described the training shortfall in these pages, noting that as medical schools have prioritized equity and diversity, test scores have suffered. Students have received less vigorous pre-clinical education in genetics, biochemistry, and epidemiology. At UCLA David Geffen School of Medicine, he wrote, students have been failing basic tests in areas like family medicine and pediatrics. Across the country, the percentage of students passing the first part of their licensure exam has fallen to 89% from 97% in 2020. President Trump's April 2025 executive order suggested replacing accreditors that enforce DEI mandates, and the LCME has finally changed its guidelines. Dr. Goldfarb's suggestion that Mr. Trump encourage an alternative accreditor for medical schools may have been the incentive the LCME needed. Medical schools can now no longer use the accreditor standards as an excuse for race-based training at the expense of foundational knowledge. Schools that focus on rigorous medical training can advertise that fact as evidence of their graduates' competence. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. From the opinion pages, hawks and doves got Iran wrong. The war turns out to be both harder and more necessary than Americans expected. By Walter Russell Mead. As the latest Gulf War intensifies and its economic consequences grow, two things seem clear. First, many Iran doves seriously underestimated the risks and cost of attempting to coexist with the regime. Second, many Iran hawks seriously underestimated the risks and cost of opposing Tehran's drive for regional hegemony through military action. The result is a war that is more necessary than doves thought and harder to wage than hawks supposed. Iran doves in past U.S. administrations hoped that a mix of conciliation and deterrence would allow America to coexist with Iran. Those hopes reflected confidence that Iran's sophisticated civil society would ultimately either overthrow the Islamic Republic or drive its evolution in a more moderate direction. They also reflected legitimate concern about the cost and risks of military conflict with a country almost 4 times the size of Iraq and close to double Iraq's population. Under the circumstances, kicking the can down the road in the hopes that something might turn up looked to a lot of smart people like the best of bad options. There were additional dovish arguments in the policy debate. On the right, many believed that America's energy independence meant that the U.S. no longer had vital interest in the Gulf. On the left and far right, rising and radicalizing anti-Israel sentiment sought to end America's alignment with the Jewish state. Iran hawks united around 2 ideas. The first was that the commitment of Tehran's rulers to dominate the Gulf made long-term coexistence between Washington and the mullahs impossible. The Iranian regime was committed to a revolutionary religious vision and determined on economic and geopolitical grounds to seize control of the Gulf region to become a world power. Tehran was hell-bent on developing military capabilities and networks that, at some point, would pose unacceptable threats to free navigation of the Gulf and of global access to its fossil fuels and other commodities. The hawks' second point was that the security of the Gulf remains a vital American interest. We may not need its oil and gas ourselves, but between the consequences to the American economy and financial markets of an interruption in supply to key economic partners and allies, and the importance of certain non-oil imports from the region, like fertilizer, the U.S. needs to keep the Gulf open. Currently, Iran's ability, at least temporarily, to close the Gulf and inflict major damage on its neighbors, even after airstrikes from Israel and the U.S., underscores the unacceptable danger that Iran's military power poses to the region. At the same time, the massive economic result of closing highlights the reality that American interests remain inextricably bound up in freedom of navigation and security of production in and around the Gulf. So here we are. Despite military successes by air and sea, Israel and the U.S. have so far been unable to keep the Gulf open or to protect the Gulf states from Iranian attacks. Domestically, Democrats are mostly locked into opposing a war that many doves think the president could and should have avoided. A conviction among many grassroots Democrats that Donald Trump poses a greater threat to America than the surviving members of the Iranian mullahcracy strengthens that opposition. It also raises the cost for Democratic politicians seeking to rally around the flag against Iran. Internationally, Allied recognition that American forces are defending a vital waterway on which their economies depend struggles with public distaste for the American president and doubts about his will and ability to win. Mr. Trump has weathered many crises. The Iran war is the greatest and gravest challenge he has faced. Harry S. Truman, Lyndon B. Johnson, and George W. Bush will all tell him how difficult war leadership can be in a divided America. As the U.S. moved toward entering World War II, Franklin D. Roosevelt sought to unite the country. In 1940, he named Frank Knox, the 1936 Republican nominee for vice president, as Secretary of the Navy. Henry Stimson, a veteran of the Taft and Hoover administrations, became War Secretary. As the war grew more brutal and costly in 1943, FDR told the country that Dr. New Deal would have to step back to make room for Dr. Win the War. Mr. Trump launched what he expected to be a short war. One hopes that optimism proves justified, but if the war continues for more than a few additional weeks, he will need to build broader support abroad and at home to carry it through, while keeping his mega base united behind him. That's a tough assignment, but nobody ever said being President of the U.S. was an easy job. Not losing has different meanings for Iran and the U.S. It's another asymmetrical 21st century war in which the enemy sees its survival as sufficient for victory. By Gerard Baker. When an Irish Republican Army bomber came within a few feet of assassinating Margaret Thatcher in a hotel room in Brighton, England in 1984, the terrorist group acknowledged the attempt with an official statement. Today we were unlucky, it said in a declaration addressed directly to the British Prime Minister. But remember, we only have to be lucky once. You have to be lucky every time. Blood-chilling and callous as its language was, the bomb killed 5 members of the governing Conservative Party. The boast was a brutally accurate meditation on the nature of asymmetric warfare. In conflicts between two sides that are unmatched militarily, such as wars by terrorists against states, the combatants have very different objectives, methods, and tactics. Typically, the weaker side has a much lower bar for success than the stronger one. It needs only to get lucky every now and then to undermine the resolve and weaken the defense of the stronger party. Terrorist nations fight asymmetrically too. It is a lesson the U.S., which, with its unrivaled military power, only ever fights asymmetric wars in the 21st century, should have learned by now. But as the war in Iran continues, it seems that we are again relearning as we go. The fundamental asymmetry is this: Iran, like earlier enemies, can't and doesn't need to beat the overwhelming superior forces of the U.S. and Israel in a straight fight. It can instead exploit the imbalance, turning the difference in tactics and goals to their own advantage. In the first few weeks of the war, we have seen how Iran has managed its tactical and material inferiority to some effect. Even as its major military capabilities have all been wiped out, it has shored up its defense through the agile use of cheap drones, mines, and other devices. But there are at least 3 elements of strategic asymmetry that Iran is also exploiting. The pain threshold is most obvious. In 3 weeks, Iran has suffered massive human and economic losses, seen its supreme leader and half its top government and military officials eliminated, sunk deeper into the loathing of its own people, and alienated almost all its neighbors. But immune from public accountability, like the famous World War I French marshal, the remaining mullah's message seems to be, my center is giving way, my right is retreating. Situation excellent, I attack. On our side, we have lost 13 service members in the fight. Every loss is a tragedy that this is, by any measure, a massively lopsided contest. But gasoline is approaching $4 a gallon. Interest rates have nudged up 50 basis points, and opinion polls are disapproving. The pain threshold seems to have been passed already. The Iranians know this. They notice when, at the first sign of political and economic distress, President Trump leaps to declare the war nearly won and close to winding down. A second asymmetry is that of targets. We emphasize our success in obliterating Iran's nuclear capabilities, its missiles, and other assets in the blitzkrieg of pyrotechnics. How many times, by the way, do we get to obliterate the same thing? Iran needs only a narrowly targeted objective with which it can hold its enemies hostage. Think of it as a form of leverage, almost like a financial transaction. For a small outlay, Iran can secure an outsized return. The obvious example is the ability to close the Strait of Hormuz and paralyze world trade with the threat that a few tankers will be blown up by mines or drones. Attacking Gulf states is another relatively low-cost activity that produces large-scale havoc. Most of all, the endgame, as in other recent wars, is asymmetric. The U.S. and Israel at times seem to have different ideas, but they appear to agree that victory will involve at least the wholesale degradation of Iran's offensive capabilities. For Iran, survival will be enough. In other words, Iran can achieve its own version of success, even as we achieve ours, a non-zero-sum outcome. At the outset of this conflict, I expressed cautious optimism that the U.S.-Israeli operation could achieve its objectives. It surely still can. But it's also become clear that the two sides are fighting on wholly different terrains. The likeliest outcome looks like a hostile regime still in place in Tehran, albeit heavily damaged, but ready to rebuild its capabilities, to remain a looming threat to stability and security, while we and Israel must maintain a costly and constant vigilance. The ultimate asymmetry is in the different meanings for the two sides of not losing this war. For America, however much we may claim otherwise, not losing is a defeat. For our weaker enemies, not losing is winning. For us, how much longer can we go on merely not losing? You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the March 24th, 2026 issue of the Wall Street Journal. We read from the Wall Street Journal every Monday through Thursday at 11 p.m. Your reader has been Corrine. Thank you for listening.
You're listening to the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Volunteer